Hello, welcome to the first installment of this semester's Gender Talk series. My name is Dr. M. Shadi Malaklu, and I am the Chair of Women's and Gender Studies at Berea College and the Director of its Women's and Gender Nonconforming Center. Thank you for joining us today for a virtual talk with Assistant Professor of Africana Studies, Dr. Jasmine Syedullah. Dr. Syedullah is a Black feminist theorist of abolitionism, a scholar of the same abolitionism that Berea's own John G. Fee advocated for and on which our great commitments are founded. Marrying her lifelong interest in social justice with the spiritual praxis that can make that justice possible, Dr. Syedullah is, among other things, the co-author of Radical Dharma, Talking Race, Love, and Liberation, published in 2016. Out in the world, she is a core member of the Radical Dharma Movement Project, bringing embodied practices of liberation to spaces of social justice, community organizing, and institutional change. At Vassar College, Dr. Syedullah holds the first assistant professor line in Africana Studies, a program that celebrates its 51st anniversary this year. Before joining the faculty at Vassar, she taught at the University of San Francisco and at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where she completed her doctoral degree in politics with designated emphases in feminist studies and history of consciousness. Dr. Syedullah's current research centers the fugitive writings of the formerly enslaved mother Harriet Jacobs and her abolitionist vision of freedom. Her talk today will address how to extend ideas of freedom beyond the binaries of resistance and reticence, beyond freedom and captivity, to consider what non-binary imaginations of freedom can be learned from those who chose to inhabit the world of slavery otherwise. Responding to Dr. Syedullah's remarks today is Berea's own director of the Carter G. Woodson Center for Interracial Education and Assistant Professor of African and African American Studies, Dr. Jessica Klunderlund. Dr. Klunderlund received her master's degree and PhD in history from Carnegie Mellon University, where she studied African American history, comparative slavery, and the history of poverty in America. She's currently working on a manuscript entitled Struggle for the Street, Social Networks and the Struggle for Civil Rights, a study of formal and informal social networks and power on the streets during the civil rights movement in Pittsburgh. Her research focuses on neighborhood street level dynamics of class and race as African Americans defined their own spaces in the 20th century. We of course regret that we cannot host Dr. Syedullah and Dr. Klunderlund and all of you in person in our center on Berea's beautiful campus over a hearty lunch as we usually do. We hope to resume on-campus programming as soon as it is safe to do so, hopefully in the fall. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the hard work of my colleagues, namely Women's and Gender Studies Associate Kimberly Saderholm and student programmer Mandy Snowden, both of whom helped organize this event. Without their tireless efforts, the Gender Talk series would not be possible. I would also like to thank our co-sponsor, the Department of African and African American Studies, for their support of this and other programming to come out of the Women's and Gender Nonconforming Center. It has been the goal of our center since its founding last November 2019 to merge Berea's great commitment to racial equity with its commitments to gender equity. We are grateful for this and other partnerships across campus that allow us to do exactly that. As you map out your spring, we hope that you will also consider joining us for our next Gender Talk event with Assistant Professor of American Studies and Women's Studies, Dr. Amy Branzell, on March 17th. Co-sponsored by Law, Ethics, and Society and Western Kentucky University, this talk will address recent displays of white supremacist terrorism at the Capitol and elsewhere that attempt to make America great again. Berea's own Assistant Professor of History, Muriel Pardon, will be responding. Without any further delay, please join me in welcoming today's speaker, Dr. Jasmine Syedullah, and respondent, Dr. Jessica Klunderlund. You are welcome to ask questions throughout using the Q&A function on your Zoom dashboard. We will address your questions at the end.
Thank you so very much. It's such a pleasure to be here. I am honored beyond words. It has been a long time coming, and so I'm just so grateful to finally be in community with your department and your professors and students. I think this is going to be a really sweet visit, and I look forward to your questions and conversation afterwards. So, the hearts we beat, Black feminist freedom in the hold of slavery. I just want to start by bringing our attention to the fact that we have these hearts that beat and that they keep time. One of the big questions that I ask in my abolitionist theory course that starts next week is, what time is it? How do you know? Who decides? Right? There's so much in the world imposing itself on us in terms of deadlines and pacing. There's so much pressing on us in terms of keeping up with the Joneses or being able to meet the benchmarks of success that mean something to other people, right? But the big thing about abolition, in addition to imagination, we're going to talk about that today, is discernment and being able to decide in yourself what you need in this moment. Like, what is it that is calling you into action? What is calling you in, right? None of my social justice work has happened without being called in either by like an inner sense of what really matters or by folks checking me and letting me know what's good, right? So this is a communal space, and the hearts we beat because of the people around us. And so part of what we are dropping into in this space is the way that we keep time with our own breath, with our own bodies, with our own hearts. And if we know what time it is, perhaps we'll know how to act and move in directions of freedom that perhaps have never been realized before. And that's really what the folks that I'm thinking with today have done and passed on to us as lineage. So I want to begin this talk, and I'll ask for the next slide. I want to begin this talk with an acknowledgement and deep recognition of those prophetic Black feminists without whose embodied activism and engaged scholarship, my own understanding of what freedoms could be possible within the hold of slavery would be impossible. These are the women who use their access to higher education to return to the archives, letters, narratives, witness, and testimonies of those who came before them, to see a vision, a way forward for themselves and for those they led. They believed, despite an absence of much evidence, that the women who lived in bondage had insights to pass on, insights on how to overcome the kinds of shackles and containment that the end of slavery could not abolish. Paula Giddings, Dorothy Sterling, Angela Davis, Joy James, the late Stephanie Camp, Gina Dent, and countless others. These are the women who saw something worth studying in the daily acts of enslaved Black women. They studied them to better understand how to struggle for their own freedom. And then it instructed us to do the same, right? So considering we are, as a political community, still struggling in our collective understanding and acknowledgement of the history of slavery in the Americas and their implications for us today, we are still considering how much of what we know about slavery we didn't learn in schools, but from films, social media, books, and stories. And I'm even more appreciative that there's this powerful generation of scholar activists to turn to for guidance as I seek to understand how we today can work together to realize the dreams born of this past year of racial reckoning. So, how can we become the prophetic force for future generations? This is the next slide. Thank you. What can we do now to heal our broken history in the present? As Amanda Gorman said in the recitation of her poem at the presidential inauguration this past month, America isn't the pride we inherit, but the past we step into and how we repair it. So the question is how? What's repair look like? How do we begin? What time is it? How do we know? Right? And next slide, please. In a 2016 talk titled Abolition and the Radical Imagination, activist scholar Angela Davis, Dr. Angela Davis, was speaking on the condition of women in prison. And she said, understanding women's incarceration helps us understand the bigger picture of mass incarceration. She reminded her audience and went on to add, of the many contributions that feminist theories can make to our activist strategies, let me quote this one. It is often the case that the greatest and most productive insight emanates from what appears to be the smallest and most marginal problem. This is why I teach and study prisons, policing, and the justice system in a way that doesn't just center the present, but also draws on the past. How have we arrived at a circumstance in a landscape of carcerality in which women were, from 1997 to 2002, the fastest growing population in prisons? My approach to the field of prison studies is unique, however, in that it's rooted in Black feminist traditions of looking, reading, citing, translation, interpretation, and analysis that takes seriously that the reach of these prison systems cannot be contained by the institutions that house them. The logics of prisons and incarceration, what I call the carceral logics and justifications of our reliance on policing to keep us safe, perpetuate cycles of dependence that extend far beyond brick and mortar prisons into our communities, into our schools and housing, into our child care systems, healthcare, social welfare. They serve and protect businesses and gentrification by sweeping up and incarcerating those whom racism and capitalism leave with inadequate resource. Incarcerating those without resources, enough jobs, food, and shelter is never the most effective way to ensure public safety. But today, especially as we face the effects of a global pandemic, we are learning how intimately interdependent our personal well-being is on the health and well-being of those most vulnerable. This is a Black feminist approach to prison study that asks us to consider how the reach of carceral logics into the private, everyday domains of Black and Brown people's lives, homes, families, neighborhoods shape their life chances, their relationships, and their well-being. Beating us down, weathering our bodies, right? My approach to the field might be simply called an embodied prison study, one that seeks to account for the presence and implications of the carceral practices that live and feed off the everyday spaces we call home, right? And so if you don't, and when I say embodied, I mean they're embodied here first. For my meditation practice, I understand that my seat, the place that I connect to the earth, the place where I am held by the world, right, by the earth, is my home first. And I can take that seat, I can take that refuge whenever and wherever I choose without constraint. And that relationship to home becomes a microcosm of the macrocosm of my relationship to the house I live in, right? And to the world I live in, to the communities, the political communities. And the things that make it hard for me to take my seat in my body are likely the same things that are making it hard for me to take my seat as a citizen of the United States, as a member of planet Earth, right? As a family in the network of the universe. These things are all interconnected, and we can start working on our relationship to them in ourselves first, and then bring out that discernment of what time it is out into the world. And that's what these women have done. That's what understanding the reach of the carceral system necessitates, because it so organizes and orchestrates the landscapes in which we live that we don't even understand what freedom is or what captivity how much of our freedom is captive, right? Let me get back to my paper. I can get off. I can go off. So, prison study, an embodied prison study, is a distinctly de-disciplinary kind of study, a place of continually unlearning and relearning those centers, unlearning that centers those most targeted, by carceral systems, both their analytic insights and the political imagination found in their writings witness dreams and their dreams of freedom. By placing the voices of the criminalized, captive, killed, as well as those loved ones left behind in conversation with both canonical and popular social theorists whose deconstruction of both freedom and captivity helped to situate modern carceral logics in their larger social and political and regional contexts. Embodied prison studies helps us who are not locked up understand what being in solidarity with those who are might require and reimagine what we mean when we call for public safety and appeals to the common good. Histories of deterritorialization, genocide, anti Black violence, white supremacy, patriarchy, and heteronationalism, class wars, and xenophobia are concealed within national ideals of home ownership, homemaking, and homecoming that comprise the American dream. We're often taught to imagine freedom as a place protected from struggle, free from suffering, safe from harm, but an embodied prison study rooted in Black feminist thought and understands that there is no escape from the worlds we create so long as we live there. There is no escape from the worlds we create so long as we live here. So, what if the moral and political ideal of freedom were not a property, but a practice? What if, like fugitives from slavery, we found the proverbial loopholes, ways to hide within plain sight, behind the trapdoors and under the floorboards of the master's house, to find strategies for surviving the anti-Black patriarchal nationalist violence that this modern freedom we say we enjoy captures us within? Fugitive roots to freedom. Escape hatches, trapdoors. These contain the very blueprints we need now to navigate the contradictions and crises of our national political identity. So currently, I'm working on areas of study that are rethinking the meaning of public safety, specifically how the carceral landscapes of personal and political freedom that ground the American dream produce patterns of anti-Black violence and police brutality that have terrorized Black and Brown communities right here in Poughkeepsie, where I am, and around the country, around the world, with impunity for generations. More than calls for reform, more than calls to defund, my own understanding from the time I was a college student, the way my heart beats, is that prison abolition is the only way that we can begin to repair the past we have inherited, and that is incumbent upon us to take up the work Black feminists of the past have taught us to continue the unfinished work of abolition today. And so I want to tell you a little bit about my own journey. And maybe since this is a bit of a storytelling part, we can just stop sharing the screen for a little bit, and then maybe I'll bring it up in a minute. Okay. So my journey to the study of abolition began as a college student when my freshman roommate convinced me that community service was not just what rich people do in order to once or twice to get into college, but a way to build solidarity across lines of difference using the tools and skills that we most enjoy, right? And I liked poetry, so I found the opportunity to facilitate creative writing workshops with women who lived in the local women's prison just outside Providence, the perfect match. Little did I realize what I would learn there. The correction officers who checked in on us eyed us with suspicion. One of them barked orders at us like we were the prisoners, and I could only imagine what it would have been like to be one under her care, so called. The writing workshops were full of meditations on things that brought the women joy, but were always accompanied by tears. Hearing what it meant for them to feel at home and how vulnerable their homes were as children and parents, as mothers and partners to police intervention and state-sanctioned separation, left an impression that has never faded. Staring out the window on the long drive back to my Ivy League campus, freedom was no longer an abstract topic of juicy philosophical debate, but the literal ability to leave, and to leave others behind. Innocence and guilt were a matter of proximity to the protections of power. Freedom became a material matter of embodiment, location, affiliation, history. How did I get to a place on this side of the bars? Not all of my family did, certainly. I'm the only one who made it to the PhD so far. I hear there's some cousins on the way. Though I have a cousin I have never met who was locked up in California, and though my father has been detained for hours for suspicion of being a terrorist long before 9/11, never before had my sense of injustice of the system been so concrete, so embodied, so visceral. It's this. So when you feel it in your body, that's when it shifts. This is not we can, go to school to understand the intellectual frameworks and debates and the historical context of these movements. But what I really want to introduce you to is, how do you feel it in your body, and how do you take that information that your body is telling you about right and wrong and mobilize it in ways that may not be charted already by the world that you live in. There may not be a protocol, there may not be a pathway. And this is really the moment that we're in right now, is one of familiarity, but also unprecedented. And so being able to draw from that embodied knowledge now more than ever is very, very important. So that's my big takeaway for today. But I'll keep telling you the story. So my ability to travel from carceral space to protected space with minimal disruption to my privacy or convenience, this was a privilege I would need a lifetime to understand and to account for. While my experiences volunteering in prisons were anecdotal, recent statistics show, or actually these are older statistics, show that the stories that I heard were not the exception but the rule. A case that you may already be familiar with is that of Marissa Alexander, who on August 1st, 2010, defended herself against her husband by firing a warning shot to deter his advance on her in their home, 9 days after giving birth to their premature daughter. Marissa Alexander was attacked by her abusive, estranged husband in their shared home, and writes, quote, "In an unprovoked, jealous rage, my husband violently confronted me while using the restroom. He assaulted me, shoving, strangling, and holding me against my will, preventing me from fleeing, all while I begged for him to leave. He attacked her while his sons were in the home. Marissa retrieved her lawfully registered gun and fired warning shots upwards into a wall to prevent him from beating her to death. No one was injured by her warning shot, but it was occurred in a state that supported a stand your ground defense for George Zimmerman. But Marissa Alexander was denied similar immunity for protection and charged with 3 counts of assault with a deadly weapon, and received a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in prison. Her appeal went on for 2 years, during which time stand your ground laws were amended to include the right to fire warning shots. However, no judge saw fit to allow Marissa Alexander to benefit from the legal augmentation which her case explicitly inspired. And we can bring the slideshow back up for the next slide. Thank you. In November 2014, Marissa Alexander accepted a plea deal with the state of Florida. The plea deal includes time served and additional 65 days and 2 years of probation serving house detention while wearing a surveillance monitor. If you can also read the Marissa Alexander official statement that I think there's a link to in the next slide. Marissa was finally released from jail January 27th, 2015. A national and international movement mobilized in defense of Marissa's freedom. Her defenders made critical connections between our national history of anti-Black violence, the culpability of criminal justice in the perpetuation of sexual predation, perpetrating violence against women, wives, daughters, sons, youth, and elders with impunity. When so many of, as Miriam Caba pronounced in an art exhibit erected to fundraise in defense of Marissa's case, when so many of us have no selves to defend, as Miriam Caba says, the question of freedom many of us in the West face has far less to do with personal sovereignty and autonomy of will, and far more to do with interdependence, collective acts of resistance, and a congregationally reinforced faith that the world as it is can change. This is the next slide. As the Free Marissa Now archive reported in 2017, and this is the next slide, sorry, 70% of people in women's prisons are mothers. The number of mothers in prison in the US increased by 122% during that period of time that I was visiting prisons between 1991 and 2007, the study says. 1.3 million children were affected by female imprisonment. And in 33 states in the US, it is legal to shackle a female inmate while she is giving birth, a female incarcerated person. Even the language is actually really important, and not reproducing the language that the state uses to really reify, essentialize the fluidity of our being into "you are a criminal, you are an inmate" is just powerful. Words are really powerful. So though that's the word that was used in the report, I want to change it here to incarcerated person. So 32 of these states do not require prison attendees to check with medical staff before determining whether or not a prisoner should be restrained. And if you're curious about reading more about women giving birth in prison, if you haven't read Assata Shakur's autobiography, I highly recommend her account for so many reasons, but particularly because of that in this instance. So what does public safety have to do with these statistics? We, you and I, generally speaking, and all, we who have, speaking generally, and hopefully this isn't too incorrect. Hopefully, we who have freedom of mobility, who have the freedom to leave violent and hostile circumstances with little inconvenience or disruption to our sense of privacy. How is our ability to feel at home in our own bodies, families, neighborhoods, communities impacted by the realities of so many for whom home is so penetrable by the state? For so many who do not have homes to retreat to for safety from structural inequality or racial and gendered violence? Can we feel what we cannot see? How are we connected to these instances, to these statistics? So much of the everyday violence of carceral power remains, even when camera phones and social media largely invisibilized. Even with camera phones and social media, the prison industrial complex, as it's understood, is largely invisibilized to those for whom criminalized communities are separated. When we as a society, and this happens in my classroom all the time, if I don't have diverse classrooms, teaching this is impossible because the majority of people who can afford to go to places like Vassar don't have immediate contact with the prison industrial complex. But the folks who are there, like I was, on scholarship, with fellowships, a lot more vulnerable to interactions with the prison industrial complex, and therefore can help us build a narrative that otherwise might not be accessible to us except through books, right, or through social media. When we as a society invest in practices of disappearing that which we don't want to heal, we might not notice when we begin to extend those toxic practices to ourselves and those who are closest to us, cutting out and caging the parts of ourselves that are not getting what they need to heal and to be whole. We police each other's blackness, wokeness, downness, gender performance, and political correctness. We exclude and cancel for slight infractions social sentences of exile without parole, and then wonder why even activist movement spaces can be places of violence, separation, abuse, or harm. Our societal reliance on prisons and policing to keep us safe has become an embodied practice, and reforms and policies will not be enough to transform this national tradition. Under pressure or threat of violence, we have been conditioned to reliance on action, on one solution, on one reaction, on one solution to all of our myriad and complex social problems. It is a practice we have all been taught since we were little to call the police, literally or figuratively. This single act is the universal solution to this complex matrix of interrelated national investments in settler colonialism, the as yet unfolding legacy of slavery, capitalism, lynching culture, rape culture, and the disposability with which we compost our lives and labors, um, and not only our own, but all of the powerful caregivers in our culture, the ways that they are rendered disposable, their work is rendered disposable. Our carceral practices then required the disruption of an abolitionist tradition passed down from the underground railways and maroon societies that taught people to survive beyond the reach of the law with no cells to defend. So much of my research looks to the past to study how people have created alternative protocols and strategies for curating their personal safety within landscapes where personal and political freedom were withheld, deferred, or denied. Poetry, song, art, movement, and dance are all the ways that we can share stories and keep account of what counts. These are all the original methods of study for those who've lived in the margins and continue to challenge both academic theories and political practices of freedom today. Testimony, narrative, and collective truth telling contain the alchemic force that works against the binary of public shame and spectacular subjection to transform suffering into something like hope, into something like healing. As the Latina feminist group writes in the introduction to their collaboratively curated Telling to Live Latina Feminist Testimonials, telling our stories to each other, even more than writing them, they write, though that may feel more familiar as academics, begins to break down the ways we compartmentalize parts of ourselves, not only for others, but in our own experience of ourselves. And you might register with that, just thinking about the ways that you compartmentalize parts of yourselves in order to show up on campus, in order to go to particular actions, right? Can you bring your whole self to your friends, to your family? By discussing our feelings of vulnerability and mistrust openly, we begin to build a space where we learn to listen, evaluate, and question each other in non-judgmental ways by also seeing the interconnections of the structures that create those fissures, right? So we can connect on that higher level instead of getting caught up in the minutia of difference. We learned how to construct, we can learn how to construct, this is their quote. We learned how to construct a safer space that was not assumed to be safe space simply on shared affinity of race or gender or national ethnic affiliations. Testimonio was critical for breaking down essentialist categories, the ways in which we're stilled by language, frozen in time. Since it was through telling life stories and reflecting on them that we gain nuanced understandings of differences and connections among us. As individuals and as Latinas, we learn to translate ourselves for each other. And this is how affinity space is built. This is how BIPOC space gets created, not just because we share the same gender, we share the same racial formation, but because we're sharing stories about what it's like to live in those bodies. How do our hearts beat? What time is it for us in relationship to those collective narratives? And how can we learn from each other how to survive the struggles of these identities by being in relationship with one another, right? By congregating rather than being in competition, the way capitalism strives to make us. Right? So these collective outlets, from testimonio to creative writing workshops in prison, are a form of collective self-defense against the systemic erasure of racism, sexism, nationalism, and the prison industrial complex. So I'm going to skip ahead here a little bit because I think... All right, so as abolitionists, and you can go to the next slide, please. As abolitionist artist and activist, Miriam Caba, yes, okay, this is where we are, director of Project NIA and Survived and Punished, teaches us in lectures, essays, art exhibits, podcasts, etc. Prolific woman. Selfhood is a privilege historically denied to racially marginalized women. Her work traces the de facto and queer folks and trans folks, of course. Her work traces the de facto and de jure opposition to Black women's right to selfhood, personhood, or personal protection under the law as a precursor to the history of gender and racialized violence that has left many who fight back and survive violence within the eyes of the law with no selves to defend, right? So Caba originated this phrase, no selves to defend, as a slogan, and it was taken up by grassroots movement activists in defense of Black women and queer and trans folks criminalized for defending themselves in the face of a clear and present danger to their lives, namely in defense of the New Jersey Four, if you know that case from 2006, Marissa Alexander's case that I just relayed, and CC McDonald's case, most notably, who's a trans woman who defended herself against a transphobic, homicidal white supremacist. Caba curated an activist exhibit of the same name in Chicago in 2014, No Selves to Defend, along with activist Rachel Kydor, to raise defense funds for Marissa Alexander's case and put her case in historical context. The exhibit employed visual art, music, song, and narrative to tell the stories of Black and brown women's struggles for sexual sovereignty, a struggle born of the plantation South against a legacy of violence that did not end with legal abolition, but survived to today and survived the victory of constitutional emancipation and continues to authorize the punishment of survivors of sexual violence into the present. Grateful for the movements against this that have arisen in the past years and pray for their continued mobilization, particularly on college campuses like this. No Selves is an abolitionist practice of critique of the kinds of freedom that requires so many of us to remain captive. It is not just a critique of anti-Black patriarchal violence against Black women and trans folks and queers and gender nonconforming folks, but also helps us to understand the connections between anti-Black violence and the state-sanctioned justifications for violence against so many people in so many parts of the world. I just learned that 37 million, was this correct? I probably shouldn't say this publicly until I get the number down, but I'll bring it up during the Q&A. The number of people who have been displaced by U.S. empire due to the war on terror is staggering. I'm just looking it up right now, but I can't find it real quick. Okay, so we'll keep going. So Caba coins No Selves to Defend as a critical way of seeing the indefensibility of Black femme selfhood and self-defense in historical perspective. In her essay and art exhibit of the same name, No Selves to Defend considers the case of Celia the slave. Celia was a woman who in 1855, at age 19, the age many of you are in college right now, after surviving 5 years of abuse from her owner, defended herself from him, bashing his head in with a stick and killing him before he could rape her again. So though Missouri had laws protecting survivors of sexual assault, the court found her guilty of murder in the first degree, a crime punishable by hanging, and as a slave, Celia was not seen as a person, but as property, and she was said to possess, therefore, no selves to defend. Caba situates this history in a larger context of what she calls the limitations of culturally authorized ways of knowing, right? In other words, the legal protocols of accountability that could grant Celia her personhood, but could only do so as punishment for crime, were not inclusive of her own internal heartbeat, right? We're not inclusive of her own internal understanding of what time it was and what was needed in that moment. As Saidiya Hartman writes in her account of Celia, quote, if the definition of the crime of rape relies upon the capacity to give consent or exercise will, then how does one make legible the sexual violation of the enslaved? We might also consider whether the wanton, they can't even call it rape, right? I own you. There is no will here. You are, as Harriet Jacobs says, a God-breathing machine. We might also consider whether the wanton and indiscriminate uses of the captive body can be made sense of within the heteronormative framing of sexual violation as rape, is what Hartman says. What Hartman, Caba, and Davis's work make visible are the ways systemic erasure has intimate effects. And oftentimes, those intimate effects, the effects that happen in our bodies, the embodied effects, are erased, illegible, and don't matter to the powers that be, to the structures of oppression, interlocking structures of oppression that keep us captive. In addition, then, to consider how breaking the silence and telling our stories has become a protocol of political self defense against systemic silencing, Caba's Black feminist abolitionism in particular contains what I'm calling a congregational protocol of accountability to those with no selves to defend. Hers is an ethic of resistance to this legal legacy of punishing survivors that moves us away from the sentimentality and essentialism of sisterhood and its implicit upholding of gender binaries towards the reality that not all lives matter, not all that not all lives matter, and that not all self-defense is justifiable, right? And so as we learn the kind of effects of the Black Lives Matter movement, part of what is being realized right now is not all of the ways that we fight for our freedom are legal, are respectable. We're really having to push against this captivity of respectability politics in order to make sure that the injuries that we are experiencing on a daily basis are recognized, recorded, and taken seriously. Abolition, Davis often says, asks us to imagine a world without prisons, without walls. But the question is how? The question is, should they crumble? And it sounds like the talk that you're going to have next week speaks specifically to the fact that they are crumbling. Should they crumble, will we be ready? Even if we believe and affirm that it's not people who prisons ought to render obsolete, but that people can transcend their reliance on prisons for public safety and render prisons obsolete, then the next question is, then what? Have we figured out ways to listen to our hearts, deal with our embodied trauma in ways that actually help us be more resilient in the face of conflict, be more resilient in the face of our oppressors, right? Or are we still so hooked up on our own differences that we're going to stay in tension with each other while the walls fall? This is the concern. And this concern really comes from that prophetic parable of the sower given to us by great Octavia Butler, right? In that story, the idea is that the end of the world is imminent, and yet people are still living as if, like the Titanic, living as if everything's going to be okay if they just stay in their fenced in communities. But the reality is that we must prepare for the walls to fall, even as we fight for them to be eradicated, to be abolished.
I'm so sorry, Jasmine. We are very much out of time, unfortunately.
So
I want to give you a few minutes to wrap up.
Yeah, no, I only had a couple of sentences left.
Then I'm so sorry, please.
No problem, no problem. So, so this is the big question that we have to ask: is how do we use our embodied knowledge of what time it is, our embodied knowledge of what isn't working in our seat, in our home, in our lives, in our communities, in our nation, to move beyond mutually assured self-destruction? What would safety look like in a world without mercenary emergency responders? Really building on the protocol of naming that Hortense Spillers discusses in her 1987 essay Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, in which naming serves as both a central object of study as well as a primary method of analysis. I'm sitting with practices of seeing, reading, and naming another future Black feminists passed down to future generations. And I'm also returning to Black feminist abolitionist aspirations and reimaginations of freedom to better learn how to midwife practical and prophetic practices of safety, accountability, and freedom from the ruins of the present. And I hope you'll join me and look forward to your questions.
Good afternoon. I want to begin my response with thanks to Dr. Syedullah and Dr. Malaklu and the Women's and Gender Studies Department for hosting this event and for drawing attention to Black women and the ways they create and continue to create their own world within bondage. So, in the summer of 2020, while the world grappled with a raging COVID-19 pandemic, we all watched the callous murder of George Floyd and the weaponized invisibility that led to the state-sponsored murder of Breonna Taylor. The world poured onto the streets to state unequivocally that Black Lives Matter. This renewed attention to the movement for Black lives and a reaffirmation of nonviolent direct action tactics revealed another side to the push for full human rights for all Black people. I recall seeing a statement circulating on social media that seemed simple on the face of it, but in reality deeply misunderstood what was happening on the streets. The statement read, "I am not my ancestors." The statement charges that the current generation of those fighting for full human rights were not willing to acquiesce to second-class citizenship and were willing to use violence to defend themselves. When I say that this is a profound misunderstanding of the work that our ancestors did, I cannot stress enough how this misunderstanding of the work of resistance and world making that especially our foremothers did in the age of enslavement and continues on to the current day. I thought of how do I reflect my ancestors? And this brought me deeply into Dr. Syeddullah's talk today. I carry with me two sets of ancestors, those of my body and those of my scholarship. And I often think of these two in conversation with one another through my work. As a historian of Black women, I am deeply indebted to the women who proved that you could not understand the institution of slavery or the process of enslavement without understanding how women's experience was both different from men and central to the exploitative logics of racial capitalism. This naming of scholars who are also in my lineage, including Dr. Deborah Gray White and Dr. Stephanie Camp, who showed us the hidden resistance of women in enslavement and asked us to wrestle with types of resistance that we don't understand. I recall learning from my great-grandmother, who was born in the generation after enslavement ended, who used forgetting as a type of resistance. I didn't understand then, but I am working to understand now how Black people built alternative frameworks of power and freedom. Enslaved women took power over life and death, and even time itself by claiming spaces beyond the reach of those who claim power over them. This Black feminist work of world building continues today, in part by how we learn to listen to the past without judging the past. Freedom has always existed on a spectrum. It isn't binary. When we think of the actions of our ancestors in the past, we cannot claim that we know what we would do in the same situation. We are in the stream of time. Similarities exist in our current context, but we cannot claim full understanding. When I think of how enslaved women built worlds, I think of the social relationships they formed, the built family, the rumor networks of information, systems of exchange and underground economies, self-theft, and so many other methods of carving out space and time within an oppressive system designed to change a person into a product for sale. These strategies continued in the years past the formal system of slavery. I think of chosen family and other alternative familial arrangements. I come from a family of sharecroppers who were deeply proud of work on their land when others decried the system as an extension of slavery. Social networks and systems of reciprocity continued as ways of navigating Jim Crow and segregation, and Black women were always the social organizational force behind the civil rights movement. Our ancestors lead the way when we think about creating an alternative social world to the logics of the carceral state. Like maroon communities where enslaved people fled to the margins of the forest, the swamps, the hills, and other waste land to organize their own society, can we reclaim and reforge the social connections and systems of reciprocity that would connect us to each other and to the past? Recent work has demonstrated that neighborhood social connections are far better at preventing harm from crime than surveillance. Additionally, restorative justice programs that aim to reintegrate people who are returning to the community after incarceration have shown much higher rates of success. We have to undo the logics that see Black people as less than human. We need to begin to world build again, to imagine alternative frameworks of connection that help us all embrace our interdependence on each other. Thank you to Dr. Syedullah for this call to embodied activism and engaged scholarship. Black feminist thought leads the way in this world building, and I hope you will join in as we imagine a world without walls where we can become, instead, our ancestors' wildest dreams. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Klunderlund, for that response. And thank you so much to Dr. Syedullah for that generative engagement. We have a bunch of questions. I'm going to consolidate them for the sake of time. The first question comes from Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Berea, Jared Brown. And Jared asks, so does this focus on practice shift the focus from the material or corporeal nature, for example, thinking of people, incarceration, political institutions, etc., as things, and instead shifting it to the actions of practices of individuals? How does this impact our thinking about our actions as individuals or our participation in such institutions? So then does this mean that home is not a place, a thing, but instead a locus of the practice of freedom?
Ooh, what a rich question. Let me, so, here's the question. I'm not sure I understand the question. Does this mean that it's not a place, but a practice? So yes and no, right? So I come from Zen. So I say, yes, of course it is a place and it's also a practice. And I don't think those things are in opposition to each other. Those things are actually in dialectic relationship with each other. So the more that I sit with my own relationship to my seat, to the place in which I live, to my kind of reason for being, dropping into what really matters to me, the more I see my home get transformed. My home has literally been transformed over the course of the practice of doing this work. And the real point for me is about alignment. How can the way that we sit in our bodies, that we sit in our homes, that we sit in our communities, be aligned with the kind of imagination of freedom that we have for ourselves and our communities? How can we start to bring those things into greater alignment in theory and practice together?
Thank you so much, Dr. Syedullah. I want to move on to a question that Alina Cooper poses. And they say, I am studying education here at Berea, and I've been thinking about how early children are taught that they should trust the police, as I learned in elementary school. In your opinion, is elementary school an appropriate space or age to flip this narrative? Is it now the responsibility of K-9 teachers to teach why the police are not people we can trust in the same way that they thought the opposite in the past?
I would discourage such reactionary. So I want to encourage us to respond to this moment and not just react, right? The kind of movement that we tend to find ourselves in makes us think, oh, I did it wrong. Let me do it the right way, right? And I actually think that there is, again, internal embodied discernment necessary. The reality is that K through 5, grade 5 students, their mind is being flipped, their narrative is being flipped by television, by the news, by being in conversation with the world as it is. And that's where we need to meet them, in the world as it is, right? That there is rich complexity in these relationships. And so if the goal in helping students think about the police in a different way is to get them to mind their own safety, then really what this is putting the onus of responsibility back on us to say, what do we really mean by safety, right? What does safe communities look like for our children? What am I going to tell my child, right, as a parent, versus what do I expect the schools to say as institutions? And what I would hope that the schools would say as institutions is that people are human beings and that the systems that we're in aren't always the most encouraging of creating good behavior. And so what we're trying to teach students, at least at the college level, is how to start creating more horizontal networks of safety. And so I would be excited about those kinds of models in school settings as well.
Thank you so much. We have a final question from our chair of African and African American Studies, Dr. Jakia Carruthers. And Dr. Carruthers starts with, what a moving talk, and thank you. Her question is, you described feeling or experiencing unfreedom in the body. Frequently, people associate embodied state violence with the violence of police and prisons. How might you describe the embodied experience or, quote, intimate effects of violence in encounters with, quote, other state powers, like Marissa Alexander's encounter with the courts, or poor people's encounters with state assistance agencies, or mothers' experiences with child protective services, et cetera?
Right. So, and this is where I was starting to gesture to the weathering literature and the fact that stress as a force on our bodies can wreak havoc. So, even in the last few years, I've been working with Poor Magazine, the poverty scholars out in Oakland, California, Lisa Tiny, Gray Garcia, and Leroy Moore among them, really leading a group of folks who are formerly incarcerated, formerly houseless, and are coming up with solutions to the problems that they face from inside. But so many of the struggles that they face, everything from trauma in their bodies, and that can affect mental health issues, and to physical health issues, right? The wear and tear of not having adequate housing, of not having shelter from the conditions of the weather, right? Not having like safe spaces to raise children. These effects on people's bodies are generational. And so part of the work that we are doing as movement work in the contemporary moment is to begin to think what wellness looks like. Like, is the work of social justice also the work of well-being? And how can we have an intersectional analysis of what well-being is that's informed by racism, settler colonialism, and heteropatriarchy, to really begin to attack those issues, not as individuals, not as just individual self-care, but as congregational efforts to transform what care looks like in this country, from something that's carceral and erasing, really disappearing large portions of the population, to something that is life-affirming, as Ruthie Gilmore says.
Thank you so much, Dr. Syedullah. That was generative in more ways than I can recount, and we are so lucky to have been joined by you today for this conversation.
I
want to thank you.
Over time.
Well worth it. Thank you again, and we hope to host you in person soon. And thank you to everyone who attended.
Thank you all so much.